Hello everyone, and welcome to our fifth and final session of our course called Exploring Daniel When God Invades a Broken World. In our last session, we looked at Daniel chapter 9 and that wonderful promise of Jubilee that we find there. After 77s, God will reveal a whole new Jubilee, a time of redemption and restoration to his people. And now as we look into chapters 10, 11, and 12, we're going to get into more depth, into that last seven, that last time and half a time. God is revealing more detail about all that. But before we get into that detail, let's remind ourselves again of what we have called the prophetic perspective. As Daniel sees these visions, he's going to see some things up close, more detail. And then further off in the distance, there will be other mountaintops that he sees with some detail. And then off in the far distance, he will see peaks, distant peaks, high summits. But he's not sure how far the distance is between where he is and those distant peaks. And if we turn that prophetic perspective on its side, it really fits into these last three chapters of Daniel. Up close, we see this heavenly messenger whom God sends to reveal this truth. Further off in the distance, we get more detail about this time and half a time, this last seven, if you will, of God's revelation. And then in chapter 12, we get those distant peaks, what God is doing through all this. So let's jump in then to the story itself. Let's look first at the heavenly messenger. In chapter 10, verse 1, we are told about a new vision, another revelation that Daniel sees in the third year of Cyrus. Cyrus, you remember, was the Persian emperor who defeated Babylon. He is the one that issued the decree for the people of Judea to be able to return to their homeland, to the city of Jerusalem, and rebuild the temple. But in the third year, so there were somewhere around 537 BC, Daniel sees another vision. And it comes in response to a period of mourning. He has been mourning for 3 weeks, we're told. We're not told exactly why. Perhaps he's still looking for answers to this 77s, that vision he had in chapter 9. But whatever it is, it's an ongoing seeking after God for wisdom, a humble way of looking for further revelation. And God responds to that by sending that revelation in the form of this heavenly messenger. But he doesn't get there right away. We are told that entire time that Daniel was in mourning, that heavenly messenger has been engaged in a spiritual battle, seeking to get to Daniel and give him this revelation. The vision he sees of this messenger looks a lot like visions that Ezekiel sees. That vision that Ezekiel sees by the Kabar River, it's a vision of God himself. Later, the Apostle John sees a vision similar to this, and it turns out to be a heavenly revelation of Jesus. But in this particular vision, it doesn't seem that we're looking at God or even Jesus in his pre-incarnate state, because we're told, quite frankly, that in this spiritual struggle, this particular heavenly messenger requires the help of another messenger, Michael, the archangel, who is meant to join with him to defeat the prince of Persia. This spiritual battle going on behind the scenes, I think it provides a context to everything Daniel is about to see and hear. Through the earthly conflicts of Greece and Persia and what will follow, God has been working. There are spiritual conflicts going on behind the scenes. God has decreed an end, but he's also decreed the means to that end. That is, he understands that there will be earthly conflicts and earthly rulers will be doing what they do. They will be conquering one another. But the sovereignty of God is such that he works at a spiritual level to ensure that his will is done. On earth, all these rulers think they're doing their own thing, their own way, but God is working through them to bring his end into view. Such is the majesty of his sovereignty. And as chapter 10 ends then, after he has delivered this vision, we are told that this heavenly messenger returns to engage with the princes of Persia and Greece. He's going to enact the vision that he has seen. And then what we see in chapter 11 is an unfolding of those earthly conflicts. What happens as God gets engaged in the background? What happens on earth? The earthly conflicts and how God is working through those earthly conflicts, beginning with Persia and Greece, to reveal his will. And now let's look at one of the most fascinating chapters in all of Scripture. The only thing like it, I suppose, are those few chapters in Isaiah that refer to Cyrus, centuries before Cyrus even exists. It's so clear and explicit is the detail. Well, here in chapter 11, we have very clear, explicit details. Again, if you believe this book was written in the 6th century BC, these prophecies were written centuries before they occurred. The chapter is broken down into 4 sections, I suppose. They kind of flow one into the next, but they kind of is a graduation in the story. It starts out very briefly describing a couple hundred years of history from the time of Daniel and the Persian Empire till we get to the breakup of Alexander's empire. And then the next section, a longer section from verse 5 through 20, we look at how that history develops, especially between 2 kingdoms that emerged from Alexander's kingdoms. The Ptolemaic kingdom in the south, that would be the area we know as Egypt, I suppose, and the kingdom in the north, eventually the Seleucid kingdoms. This would be the area of southern Turkey, Syria, and to the east of that, Iran and so forth. That's the area that they dominated throughout history. So there is this story of conflict between the south and the north. Throughout this text, you see references to the king of the south. This is not one particular person, but this is a line of kings that follow one after another in this Ptolemaic kingdom. And a reference to the king of the north. Again, not one individual, but this line of kings that emerge in the Seleucid kingdom. And then in verses 21 to 34, we have an extended treatment of one of those kings of the north. It's Antiochus IV Epiphanes. The details are clear. This is about him. We've already seen rather clear references to him, especially in chapter 8, but also in chapter 9. Now we give even more treatment about Antiochus. So we're clear then about this history. But then when we get to verses 35 to 45, there's a bit of a controversy. What are those verses about? Do they extend the story of Antiochus, or do they move on to another period? Before we look at this in more detail, I did want to show us a map. When you look at the map, you can see the Seleucid kingdom in the north and the Ptolemaic kingdom in the south. And in between them, in that middle arrow there, is the former kingdom of Judea. And all throughout this history, Judea is kind of a pawn in between these 2 kingdoms. They're battling out who owns Judea. To whom does Judea pay their tributes? They want to own those trade routes through that run all the way through Judea. So it's this ongoing period of history. And as we look through the whole section from 1 to 34, we see really explicit details that cover, again, over 400 years, more than 20 incidents that are described with a great deal of detail. Now, it's beyond the scope of this class. I'm not going to walk through all of them individually. There's a handout available in the link. You can follow all of them. But they are so clear that really no interpreters are debating that this is about this particular point in history. In fact, as we mentioned in the first session, these details are so accurate that many people have concluded they were written after the fact. That's a major reason why some people argue that the book of Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC, during the time of Antiochus. After all these events are described, they are so accurate. So I would just urge you to read through them, look at the handout. There are many other resources on the internet that'll help you see that this is indeed accurate statements of history. But if, as we have argued in this class, that these are prophecies, they were legitimately written in the 6th century BC, this is some sort of prophecy. To see this level of detail spelled out blow by blow with very clear references to what is coming. Clearly, if this is prophecy, God is sending a very clear message. He is indicating that he understands how all the chess pieces are going to move between now and then. And yet, the incredible sovereignty of God is such that it will work through all those moves and those counter moves by all these kings who think they're working independently. He is sovereign enough to work through all that to ensure that his end will come. He's already determined how this history is going to play out. And in the end, he's going to use these very difficult conflicts, these hard situations in the history of God's people to reveal something amazing, something unbelievable, something extraordinary, this new jubilee that he declared in chapter 9. In verse 35, we encounter something of a transition, and the question is whether we are moving to a new period in time. There's a clear reference here till the time of the end. The text says, some of the wise will stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end. For it will still come at the appointed time. In verse 34, we see a reference to those who are opposing Antiochus. And in history, we know them as the Maccabees. They did oppose Antiochus and eventually were able to recapture Jerusalem and reconsecrate the temple. But still, they are not perfect yet. God is still working to bring about the fullness of that end, to perfect those who are doing good. There's a look out toward the future, if you will. And it sounds a lot like the promise that was made in chapter 9, verse 24, where we are told that at the end of those 77s, God is working to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness. So we seem to be talking about that same end, that the struggle of the Maccabees starts, or it's just a sign of God working for a perfection of his people and a cleansing and a restoration of his people to come sometime out in the future. But God is still on track for all of that. And then after verse 35, we see the reference to a new king. And there is some sort of debate here as to about which king we're talking about. If we look at the detail, we get several types of description, but none of them seem absolutely explicit enough to identify that person clearly. Not like the earlier verses where it was clear which king we were talking about. These are a little more general and vague in nature. We're told that he will exalt himself among the gods and will say unheard of things about the God of gods. So again, it seems to indicate some sort of struggle with the God of the Judeans, right? He will be successful in time of the wrath until the time of wrath is completed. Again, kind of general there. He will disregard the God of his ancestors and the one desired by women. This is even more obscure. One thing we know for sure is Antiochus did seek to introduce the Greek gods, the Hellenistic gods, into his territories wherever he went. So he is trying to honor the Greek traditions. He's trying to unify his empire under the Greek religion. This reference to the one desired by women, we're not really sure what that means. Some have suggested it's a local god, a Tammuz or some other god that is known to be the one desired of women, and Antiochus is suppressing that, or whoever this king is. We're not really sure. The text says he will instead honor a god of fortresses unknown to his ancestors. He will honor that god with costly gifts. And a foreign god will help him attack other mighty fortresses. And he'll lend out lands and authority to those who support him. Well, again, this is general in nature. I mean, this could apply to many dictators throughout the world. So there's not enough here to really say explicitly who it is. Now, various folks have argued different things. We would assume that this still applies to Antiochus, were it not to verse 35. Verse 35 indicates this time of the end. But are we still talking about Antiochus? Certainly everything described here could apply to him. There's nothing here that would not necessarily apply to him. Some folks, however, have assumed that we move on to a different period, that this king is still to be revealed somewhere out in the future. either in the future of Rome or maybe even in a future Antichrist. It's hard to say explicitly from this reference. But as we said, nothing here is explicitly outside of Antiochus. I mean, it could all be reference to him. And what makes this even more confusing is when we move to the following verse, verse 40, it looks like there's another transition in view here. And again, this adds more layers of mystery, if you will. In verse 40, it says, "At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood." Now, there are a couple reasons here that we know this is some sort of period transition. One is this reference to the king of the north. When we were in verse 34 and we were talking about Antiochus, he was the king of the north. Now we have a new king of the north being described here. So something has shifted here. The other truth is that as we understand how the reign of Antiochus comes to an end, this is not how it ends. It's not as if a king from the south comes and another king of the north comes and wipes him out. That is not how his reign ends. In fact, what happens, Antiochus dies of illness. And after him, the kingdom begins to disintegrate. So this particular event, as described in verse 40, it never really happened in the reign of Antiochus. Now, for those who assume that the book of Daniel was written in the 2nd century during the time of Antiochus, they look at this verse and suggest that perhaps it's unfulfilled prophecy. It is people of the time looking ahead as best they can and determining the end of Antiochus, but it doesn't occur. It's unfulfilled prophecy. But for those of us that see this as legitimate prophecy and who believe that God is foreseeing the future, something else must be going on here. It must go beyond Antiochus. So let's look at the description of what's really happening here, the battles that are being described, and see if we can maybe sort out a historic thread that is being woven here. If we look at that whole description of more battles, it starts off, as we said, in verse 40, talking about the king of the south and the new king of the north will engage him, that is, whoever him is, perhaps the new Seleucid ruler, with a full army of chariots, cavalry, and a great fleet of ships. So there's going to be a new invasion here sometime after Antiochus if this story continues. He, this new king of the north, will sweep through many countries, including the beautiful land. And the beautiful land we have pointed out before, it's a way of referring to the land of Judea. Edom, Moab, and Ammon will be delivered from him. Now, this is a very explicit reference. We'll show a map here on the screen. We'll show you what we're referring to. It lands on the other side of the Dead Sea. They are lands through which the children of Israel passed to get into the promised land back in the days of Exodus. And then subsequently, they are tribes that are always in some sort of conflict with Judea and with Israel. Well, these particular lands will be delivered from whoever this new king of the north will be. And also we get some details about Egypt, including Libya and Cush. If you look at a map, and again, we'll put one up on the screen here, Egypt is kind of in the middle, Libya is off to its west, and Cush is to its south. This whole land that is greater Egypt, at some point that will fall to this new king of the north. And then the story ends with rumors from the east and the north. There were rumors somehow getting to whoever this new king of the north is. And based upon those rumors, he'll redirect his wrath and he'll send his armies to pitch tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain. It seems like an invasion of Judea there at the mountain outside of Jerusalem. And then he will come to an end and no one will help him. So how do we sort through all this information and figure out how to interpret what part of history, if any, are these verses meant to describe? Well, as we mentioned, some people regard this section as unfulfilled prophecy. People in the 2nd century BC, in the time of Antiochus, look ahead to this defeat of Antiochus. But as we said, this is not how it occurs, so that's one option. Other people see these phrases referring to the end and the decline of the Seleucid kingdoms and the introduction of a new king of the north, the Empire of Rome. And still others see this as a reference to a future battle out there between an Antichrist and world powers against God's people in Jerusalem. Well, let's look first at the possibility that this is a historical reference. See if facts line up that could fit what is described here. And just as we do that, remember now that this reference to this king of the north, it's not a reference to one individual. As we've seen before, the kings of the north, the king of the south, it's really a reference to a line of leaders. So is there a new line of kings that is being introduced to the story? Well, if we follow the history of the Seleucid Empire, after Antiochus, the kingdom really starts to fall apart. Various factions are fighting among one another. The kingdom gets divided. There's weak attempts to hold it together. Then it breaks apart again. And the truth is, in 145 BC, the then emperor, by the name of Alexander Belos, in 145 BC, the king of the south, then at that point, Ptolemy VI, does invade and does defeat the current emperor of the Seleucid Empire. So this fact, mentioned in 1140, did actually occur subsequent to Antiochus. So that is a fact that kind of fits. Now, what about this new king of the north? Are there any facts that fit that? Well, it is interesting, at least, that the Roman general Pompey, he invades and cleans up what's left of the Seleucid Empire kind of around 63 BC, somewhere like that. Rome is getting nervous about some of the disorganization in that section of its republic. And so Pompey comes to restore order, we get the tax revenues flowing again. So he does invade with a full army, with the chariots and cavalry and full fleet of ships. And he does sweep through this land like a flood, as we hear in 1140. So that side sort of fixed. Now, Pompey himself is not the king, but he represents the king, and he comes at the right time. It's interesting that at this point, the him here, that this new king of the north defeats him, him is no longer the king of the north, which kind of fits the situation. There is no more Seleucid Empire. There's just individuals who represent different cities. So this may be a reference to the Roman takeover, if you will, of the former Seleucid Empire. And significantly, Pompey, after he cleans up the Seleucid Empire, he does go and invades the beautiful land in Judea. He goes to the mountain, even goes into the temple itself. There's a rival factions fighting over control of the temple, and Pompey picks a side and reestablishes the temple under one of those factions. So this all happens in 63 BC. So if Pompey, as the representative of this new king, perhaps the story is talking about him. Interestingly enough, also, remember in this description, we are told that Moab, Edom, and Ammon, that those territories are never really taken by this king. They were not defeated by them. And it is interesting that these areas that eventually become known as the Nabatean Empire, the Nabatean territories, their relationship with Rome was always problematic. Both when Rome was a republic and eventually when it became an empire, they were always somewhat difficult to deal with. There were treaties, they were treated as allies. It's really not till much later, 106 AD, where Trajan actually is able to defeat these territories and officially annex them to the Roman Empire. So this story kind of lines up that this new king of the north, at least for a period of time, could not take the territories of Edom, Moab, and Ammon. But the exact opposite is true of Egypt and Libya and Cush. Remember, again, according to the chapter 11, these territories are taken by this new king of the north. And if we follow the story of Rome as it flows from Pompey through Caesar, Antony, eventually Augustus, they eventually suppress all of Egypt during the days of Cleopatra. You know the famous story of Cleopatra. Eventually, Rome becomes the lord of all Egypt, if you will, including these areas of Libya and Kush. So, again, the invasion of Rome would seem to line up with the story as we find it in chapter 11. What's also interesting here is that we get to the end of chapter 11, in verse 44, we see this reference to reports from the east and the north that somehow incite this new king to launch an invasion into the holy mountain between the seas. Well, under Nero, there is a disturbance in Judea, a revolt in Judea. And he calls on one of his generals, Vespasian, who is actually in Egypt. So remember, verses 42, 43, they deal with Egypt. And so the story seems to pick up from Egypt. And that's where Vespasian was before he's recalled to Rome. His son Titus is still in Egypt. And so this idea that a rumor came from the north, perhaps Rome, a rumor came from the east, perhaps Judea, it incites the wrath of this new king of the north, which is now Nero, and he sends these armies in, and they obliterate Judea. It is that invasion, that combined invasion, first by Vespasian until he's called back to Rome, then by Titus when he invades Jerusalem, puts the siege around Jerusalem, and actually is the one who destroys the temple in 70 AD. So it brings us to this place of destruction. It's interesting then that the story, if this is really what chapter 11 is about, it's basically taking us to that same image we saw in chapter 9 and in chapter 7 especially. This beast of 10 horns in chapter 7, this small horn that came up from 3. And we said that that small horn, it kind of looks like Antiochus, but it seems to go beyond Antiochus. There's another emperor out there that's going to do something tragic. A look-alike, if you will. Antiochus is kind of a preface to all this. And also, when we looked at chapter 9, we referenced that time and a half a time, this idea that it's during this time, in this last 7, that we have Antiochus. But then, after a period of times, we get to this last half of this period, the half a time, and then we see something else, this new abomination of desolation. And sure enough, that's what we find here in 70 AD, the destruction of the temple. And then we have that last verse, verse 45, which simply says that his time will come to an end and no one will be there to help him. Well, I think if we're going to see this as a historic figure, what we see is really the fall of Rome, which at this point is several centuries out from the time of Titus. But if we back up and look at this whole view, this story from verses 35 to 45, it could accept this historical thread. In other words, this historical thread kind of tells that story, and it would be a prophetic way of telling that story. Now, other people have looked at these verses and seen Augustus in them, or other threads of Roman history, and the references are vague enough that it's probably not going to be possible to nail things down precisely. But generally speaking, these verses, they do sort of describe that period from Antiochus to Titus, that period, that time and half a time, that bring us to this occasion where God is going to do something marvelous. But then again, there are other people who believe this is still far off in the future, that there will come another king of the north in the time of the Antichrist, that there will be a worldwide alliance of nations that will come together. They refer to chapters like 38 and 39 in Ezekiel, this battle of Gog and Magog. They're going to come together and fight against restoration of the kingdom after the temple's been restored. So there are folks who still see this off in the future. And then, of course, if you're going to see this in the future, you're going to have to do something with those references to chariots and cavalry, fleet of ships, that will still be around perhaps. But cavalry and chariots, what is that in a future battle? Well, some argue that those are anachronisms, that in the future, the new version of chariot and cavalry, tanks or other weapons, whatever they are, it's prophecy's way of referring to these modern weapons. Perhaps. But again, there's no way to really verify the future until we get to the future. So it's another option that's out there, and wanted to make you aware of that. As chapter 11 ends, then, we see this great king of the north, this new king of the north, now attacking God's people. And this is where chapter 12 picks up the story. And we have a new vision about how that battle is going to be ended, how God is going to deliver his people. That last chapter really falls into two sections. That we have the vision itself in verses 1 to 4, and then again, like we've seen so often through the rest of Daniel, we have a heavenly explanation of that vision. And that explanation is sometimes more mysterious and more confusing than the vision itself. But in any case, the vision itself, it starts in verse 1, and we are told there that at that time, in other words, when it looks like the new king is attacking, this new king of the north is attacking God's people, God will get engaged. He will send Michael, again, the great prince who protects your people. So God is going to work through that time to deliver his people in the middle of this very difficult time of distress. You know, when you're under that kind of distress, in that kind of warfare, one may begin to wonder if they matter. Do they matter? As they are defeated and killed and vast number of people are destroyed, do they still matter? I mean, if this is a reference to the time of Titus and the destruction around the temple, I mean, the details from Josephus tell us they were horrible. I mean, the desecration was unbelievable. Men, women, children just slaughtered mercilessly. One would begin to wonder, is God still at work? Is he still active? Well, this vision tells us, yes, God will deliver. He's not forgotten about anyone who worked for him or were part of his people that served him faithfully. Their name are written in a book. God has the name of those faithful people written in a book. They're not forgotten. They're not lost in the tragedies of history. God has their name in a book. He will redeem everyone who is faithful. He keeps track of all that. One need not worry about being lost in all this. And even if they die, God will remember them. That's what we're told also in this vision, that even folks who die in the battle, they'll be woken up. The text calls it being asleep in the dust. That's a euphemism for being buried underground. God will wake them up. It's just sleep to him. He will wake up and make sure they get the reward they deserve, even if they're killed in battle. And those who perpetrated the battle, those who launched the persecution, if they die, yeah, they're still not out of the woods. God will wake them up too, and they'll receive judgment for their actions in the condemnation. So death is not an obstacle for God getting what God wants. He will redeem his people, and he will punish those who oppress God's people. Some have seen in this reference a reference to resurrection, people rising again from the dead. It's hard to resist that image, especially those of us who live after the time of Christ. And of course, we read in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 15 and so forth, that tells us about the general resurrection of the dead at the end of time. It's hard not to see all of that somehow implied in this text. But the text itself is more restrictive than that, I think. The text here is just saying that death is not the end of the story. That if you die in the service of God, he will wake you up. If you die in persecuting evil, he will wake you up. And you will receive. There is an accountability. And for those that are faithful, we're told at the end of the vision that they will shine like heavenly stars. All the work that people do, all the work that goes into serving God, being faithful, fighting the powers of evil to do what God requires, working his righteousness in the world. it looks like their light has gone out. When the oppressors come and defeat them, it looks like all the lights have gone out. But God is promising his faithful people that as they serve, they will shine like the stars. Their lights will be seen for all eternity. Their lights will not go out because God's light does not go out. That's the vision. And at the end of the vision, Daniel is simply told to seal up all these words in a scroll. Well, again, as we saw in earlier visions, we go from this now to the explanation section. And in the explanation, it has a lot to do with this time and a half a time, the time frame that we talked about in chapter 9. Daniel's there at the end of the vision, and there's this river, and there's this conversation that goes on over the river, a river that seems to divide the other world from this world. And we see the explanation back and forth, and we see that distant peak, if you will, across the river on the other side. And this conversation goes on about how long. And what we find out is that we're back to that time and a half a time. There's something about that when God is done with what he's doing in history, at that moment, something will occur. Then it will come after the power of his people has finally been broken. Again, if this is a reference to Titus, I mean, that really occurs. At this point, the temple is destroyed. The people of Judea, they would no longer be what they were before after this event. I mean, obviously, the Jewish faith would continue and continues to this day, but it's no longer a nation as it was, as a kingdom ruled by a king. That doesn't occur. And then we get those mysterious numbers again about 1,290 days, that last part, that right before the final Jubilee is revealed. And then that promise, as we mentioned last week, that if we stand past that to 1355, then you're in the new Jubilee. You're past what God is going to do. And then we get that final verse. The closing verse of the chapter says, "As for you, go your way till the end. You will rest, and then at the end of the days, you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance." So Daniel, just you've done your part. You just keep doing what you're doing. And then when you sleep in the dust, you will be risen up and you will get your inheritance. Your role is over. But we're left with this anticipation that there's more yet to come, that the full story has not been told. There's this scroll that has been sealed until the time where God is ready to open it again. When will that happen? What will that look like? It seems to us then that as we come to the end of the book of Daniel, God is still pointing us further to a new time of revelation where he will pick up the story where he leaves off with Daniel. In the Gospels, Jesus picks up this story very explicitly. In Matthew chapter 24, he says clearly, "So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel," let the reader understand, "then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Jesus is explicitly saying, this is the story of Daniel. There's something taking place here. Now, he knew that Daniel was in the past. He knew the stories of Antiochus. He knew everything that happened in the past. But he's saying something is still to come. In the context, he's talking to them about false claims of Messiah, that others will come and claim to be the Messiah. And he wants them to be assured that he's the Messiah. They don't have to chase these rumors. And he's warning them that there's going to be something catastrophic happen here. And it's going to create a lot of uncertainty and instability. And he wants them to know that this is all part of God's plan. In fact, it's something that God had predicted all the way from the days of Daniel, all the way back from the days of Daniel. It is this abomination of desolation. And after Jesus dies, resurrects, and ascends to heaven, there is an abomination of desolation that happens. The temple is destroyed. Titus comes in, he destroys the temple. It is a terrible, horrible time of desolation and desecration. And we know from historical evidence that there were claims of messiahship and fighting about who is the Messiah and who is the king. Jesus is warning his disciples that they're going to be there for that fulfillment. They're going to see all of those things work themselves out that Daniel has been predicting. And he wants them to remain faithful through all of that. Now, of course, some people think that Jesus is still talking about the future, that there will be another abomination of desolation in the future. That, again, the temple will be rebuilt, and at that point it will be desecrated, and at that point there will be a lot of persecution, and there will be rumors everywhere. That may be true. We don't know about the future. But what is true in Jesus' time is there is this abomination of desolation, and there is all of this foment that happens. And what Jesus seems to be telling them then is, don't be dismayed. Don't get discouraged. Don't give up the faith, because God is acting there to reveal his plan. Through Jesus, he is the one that introduces this new jubilee into the world. Through who he is, there will be restoration. And we can be confident in the total restoration of God's people because of the work of Jesus. I think that really is the focus of what Jesus is saying here, to give us more information about this fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy. So as we come to the end of the book of Daniel, let's ask one more time, what's the point? Well, I chose to focus on these two verses from Daniel chapter 12, verses 2 and 3. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. I think God is speaking to those of us who want to be part of the solution. The wisdom refers to people who are seeking to follow God, who are seeking to understand God, to live in the light of his truth, and then to be working for the right things in this world, to continue to do right and promote the right things in this world. And what the story of Daniel has shown us, that God's sovereignty through history, it assures us that we can trust God's promise. He's going to use our faithful efforts to shine his light into this broken and dark world. And when we're done, there is a reward. We didn't deserve it. We didn't earn it, in a sense. This is all by God's grace. God gives us a reward out of his grace. But it's still our reward, and God says it's out there for us, so we don't need to get discouraged that things don't seem to be working out. We don't have to give up on being faithful. God has proven over and over again through these visions to Daniel that he is sovereign over the events of history. Even if there are oppressors destroying and fighting with one another and even seeming to kill his own people, God is still sovereign. He's been planning the whole time for this event of Jesus to come and die on the cross for our sin. That in the middle of human insanity, God brings this work of grace and restoration. That in the very midst of the brokenness, he is redeeming his people. He is restoring his people, allowing them to go back where he always wanted them to be, in his place of fellowship, there to dwell forever. We can rest assured that our faithfulness is worth it because our God is faithful. I hope this journey through Daniel has strengthened your faith. It has certainly strengthened mine. Let's continue to work for our God and let his light shine through us as we do his will. May the Lord bless you as you continue to follow him.